Hello and welcome to American Catholic History. If you like our podcast, be sure to rate us and give us a review wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Noelle Heaster-Crow.
And I'm Thomas Macconcrada.
Get ready, folks, because today's topic is St. Patrick's Day. So Tom's gonna get a little Blarney happy.
Guilty as charged in anticipation. I mean, I have kissed the Blarney Stone on 2 different occasions, so you tell me.
I don't know how I'm gonna make it through this episode. Oh, but there was no mistaking that he'd kissed the Blarney Stone when I married an Irishman.
Yes, and what can I say? If you're lucky enough to be Irish, you're lucky enough.
Yeah, okay. You're overdoing it now.
What can I? Yes, I am. So what?
Okay, yeah, well, before you overdo it even more, let's get into our topic, which is how Irish Catholics here in America made St. Patrick's Day was such a huge deal, really, all around the world.
Yeah, St. Patrick was one of the great missionary saints. He brought Christianity to Ireland in the 5th century. He is known primarily through his few extant writings, his confessions, and a letter he wrote. The well-known Prayer of St. Patrick, or St. Patrick's Breastplate, comes from his confession. All of these are wonderful fodder for meditation. And though he was among the earliest of the great missionary saints, he isn't the only one who converted an entire nation and took on the dominant pagan culture in that place. St. Augustine of Canterbury for Britain, St. Boniface for Germany, St. Francis Xavier for the Far East, and so many more. But none of them gets the same annual celebration that Patrick gets.
Exactly why Patrick gets this observance is an interesting phenomenon, and frankly, it's due in no small part to Protestant persecution in Ireland and here in America.
Yes, and it's also due to the way Irish Catholics asserted themselves in the New World, how America has historically made it possible for immigrants both to assimilate and to retain their native culture, and to the incredible tendency of America to export our cultural phenomena.
So let's give a bit of history. Patrick was a 5th century missionary to Ireland and the first bishop of Armagh, which is the primatial see of Ireland to this day. After he died sometime in the mid-400s, he was venerated as a saint. But the church didn't have an official canonization process at the time. His traditional date of death, March 17th, wasn't added to the liturgical calendar until the 1630s.
Now, for about 1,000 years, celebrating St. Patrick wasn't a problem. Ireland was ruled by factions of warring chieftains for centuries, but they were basically all Catholic. Even when Henry II of England came in and established English dominance of Ireland in the 12th century, that wasn't a problem because England was Catholic too.
To be sure, the English were never quite benevolent lords. They dominated Ireland more as a way to control their own backyard than because they actually cared about the Irish people. But at least they were Catholic, and so allowed Catholic celebrations and religious establishments.
Yes, and it wasn't until the 1530s when King Henry VIII decided that he would rather have his woman than remain in God's church that things got hairy for Catholics in Ireland. So beginning in the 1530s, Catholicism was outlawed, the monasteries dissolved, priests and religious executed in mass numbers, and things were even more terrible. But most of the Catholics didn't lose their faith.
However, this new religious oppression did mean that even more Irish people were suddenly heading all over the world, as indentured servants or even slaves, as priests and religious serving elsewhere, or if they had the means, just fleeing the oppression and looking for a better life elsewhere.
Over the centuries, that increasingly meant crossing the Atlantic for the New World. But at this point, the New World was still quite new. Columbus had sailed the ocean blue just 40 years prior to the English Reformation. The English first came over in the 1580s, settling at Roanoke, but that failed, and then permanently in 1607 at Jamestown.
But the earliest recorded celebration of St. Patrick in the New World took place in a rather unexpected place.
Oh, sí, por supuesto. Now, we mentioned that some Irish traveled the world as priests. Well, it appears that one Irish priest, Father Richard Arthur, was a chaplain to the fortified Spanish settlement at St. Augustine, Florida, at the opening of the 17th century. Records indicate that around that time, St. Patrick was considered the patron protector of the settlement's maize crops, of all things. Remember, Patrick wasn't even officially on the calendar until the 1630s, but he had been celebrated annually on his traditional date of death, March 17th, from shortly after his death 1,200 years earlier.
Now, according to records from the era, a volley of cannons marked the celebration of St. Patrick's Feast on March 17th, 1600, making that the first time the day was celebrated here in the Americas. And then, the following year, likely at Father Arthur's instigation, the people of St. Augustine held a parade in honor of St. Patrick, or, as they would have called him, San Patricio. So, Feliz Dia de San Patricio, I guess. My Spanish is terrible. But that's what would have been spoken long before Happy St. Patrick's Day.
I gave you that in exchange for me having to say French all those times. Yes. Father Arthur leaves the history books shortly after this. Whether he died or sailed to another location, we don't know. And the parade was not kept up. So while St. Augustine can lay claim to the first ever St. Patrick's Day parade in the New World, they do not have the oldest continuous annual parade.
No. To get to the oldest continuous celebration of St. Patrick's Day in the New World, we have to fast forward about 130 years and travel up the coast about 900 miles to, of course, Boston.
Yes, up to where we expect to be. It is now the 1730s, and the city of Boston is about 100 years old. Long a bastion of Puritanism, things have relaxed a bit, and some Irish immigrants have come over. In 1737, a group of more well-to-do Irish settlers gathered on March 17th to mark their native home's patron saint and to establish the Irish Charitable Society, which was formed to aid less fortunate Irish immigrants.
Now, we're not absolutely sure if these particular Irishmen were Protestant or Catholic. It seems possible they were actually Presbyterian, but they at least weren't completely anti-Catholic. This gathering and dinner became an annual thing in Boston, making Boston's celebration of St. Patrick's Day the oldest continuous celebration in the New World, as we said before.
Yes, but that still wasn't quite the big public spectacle like we see nowadays with parades. That was no more than something that, a lot of ethnic groups do in their new home countries.
Right. For the beginning of the big public displays, we travel down I-95 to New York City, and we check in on the 1760s. In the 1760s, New York was garrisoned by the British military, and the British military had Irish units.
Of course they did. Now, we talked in another episode about how Catholicism was illegal in the New York colony during this period, and Catholic priests like Father Ferdinand Farmer risked hanging for just entering New York. But the law seems not to have applied to these Irish units. Perhaps since they were British soldiers, they were subject to a different set of laws and immune to the local New York laws. Whatever was the case, on March 17th, 1762, proud Catholic Irishmen in the British Army rose early and marched in a parade through the streets of Lower Manhattan to a tavern for a special St. Patrick's Day breakfast. Yes, kegs and eggs is an early part of the tradition. The annual parade became a thing.
Can't let that tradition,
Heck no.
founder. And what happened in reaction to this parade all but guaranteed that the annual parade and demonstration of Irish pride would grow and would be exported to other parts of the American colonies. Starting the next year, anti-Catholics in New York began counter-demonstrating on March 16th and 17th. They conducted anti-Catholic activities, including hanging effigies of Irishmen dressed in tattered rags with necklaces of potatoes and with whiskey bottles in their hands. This was a practice known as patty making.
And this gets to why the celebration of St. Patrick's Day grew to be such a thing here in the States and why it spread around the world. The Irish were the first major immigrant group to the 13 colonies after the English settled in, and then, decades later, they were the first major group of immigrants after the Revolution. They were the first to bring their own native culture and all of their cultural pride in large numbers, and they were the first significantly Catholic body of immigrants. They brought it all into this new nation that guaranteed religious liberty and allowed cultural autonomy in its very foundational documents. Now, to be sure, there had to be some assimilation to get along in society and in the markets, but at home and in their own enclave, provided they weren't violating the laws of civil society, they were free to be Irish and Catholic with all that meant.
After 700 years of English cultural and economic dominance, with the last 300 years including brutal religious persecution, this was a whole new experience. Here, they could fight back against those who violently suppressed their celebration of their faith and their Irish identity, and the laws of the land protected them. Here, they could take part in government and join the military without taking an anti-Catholic oath. Here, they could rise in society by their own industry, and there was no aristocracy or structure that made further advancement impossible. In Ireland, the oppression continued until the emancipation of the Catholic faith in 1829.
But those were the laws of the land here in the USA, based on the high-minded ideals of our national founding. Now, the actual practice of the high-minded ideals and the application of the laws was another matter.
Isn't it always?
Yeah. And this was where Irish Catholics found the celebrations of St. Patrick's Day an important statement.
The annual demonstrations were a way to assert themselves in society, keep their own spirits elevated, and let those elements of society who hated them know that the Irish Catholic were not going to go quietly back into that dark night of oppression. They were not prepared to allow this nation, which was founded on liberties denied to them back home, to abandon those ideals and become, well, more like the oppressive regime they'd fled.
So in that way, the annual celebration of St. Patrick's Day is an annual celebration of what the United States was founded to be, a place where people had an opportunity to live together in common society, even if they were separated from one another in some ways. It's okay to retain your native customs within your local sphere, until they infringe on others' rights, of course, but you also have to find those ways to live in community in the larger sense. It's, subsidiarity and federalism at the same time.
So in a way, it makes sense that St. Patrick's Day would become a big civic thing here in America while remaining just a religious holiday in Ireland. In Ireland, it was a high holy day, the celebration of the island's patron saint. But they didn't have to continually assert their cultural identity among other cultures in a strange land because, they were home.
In fact, since it was a high holy day, Irish law prohibited pubs to be open on St. Patrick's Day. Whew. For more than a century, even after Catholicism was liberated, St. Patrick's Day in Ireland didn't resemble the American celebration. That began to change in the 1960s when television became more widespread in Ireland, and the Irish people saw just how much fun Americans were having. So, through television, America's Irish festival of St. Patrick's Day was repatriated, if you will. Now, it's fair to say they've caught up. Dublin annually hosts not only a parade, but a 4-day festival that more than 1 million people attend.
Yeah, I'd say they've caught up.
Yeah.
Nowadays, St. Patrick's Day celebrations with parades and festivals can be found in many cities around the world, including in Russia and Australia.
Which makes sense because you do know what we call a slow Irishman.
Of course, an Australian.
You got it.
I'm not sure John Boyle O'Reilly would appreciate that joke.
Oh, he'd laugh. He probably originated the joke.
Well, I mean, maybe you're right. Yeah. He did have a way with words.
Yes.
American-style celebrations of St. Patrick's Day can also be found in the Caribbean, plus in Japan, Argentina, Germany, and, many, if not most, countries around the globe.
Absolutely. This American cultural export is really a collaborative effort between America being America and people of Irish ancestry being Irish. We in America have a history of exporting our cultural phenomena, for good and ill, but this particular one was not spread by American propaganda or economic activity like blue jeans, Hollywood movies, and democracy. This one spread because there are roughly 80 million people of Irish ancestry living in dozens of countries around the world, and lots of them are happy to celebrate their heritage. Wherever you go around the world, you'll find an Irish pub, if you know the song. They had no problem adopting this American tradition.
Right. So that's the broad strokes of the history of where the celebration came from and why it's such a big deal around the world. But before we close, let's say a few words about a few particulars of the celebration, like corned beef and cabbage and wearing green.
Yeah, I'll start off with what this celebration is not. It is not a day to get riotously drunk and act like a bloody hooligan. This came up also when we talked about the history of Mardi Gras. Secular culture has this tendency to latch onto the celebration part of the feast day and turn it into an excuse for bad behavior, divorced from the sacred and important reasons for the celebration. Celebrating with a beverage or two is fine if you're able to handle it responsibly, but no sacred feast should ever be taken as a day to focus on drinking to excess and wearing offensive clothing. St. Patrick's Day is a day to celebrate the saint who brought Christianity to Ireland and the Irish culture which came from that baptism.
Okay, so that being said, let's start with some Irish cultural things to talking about one that is actually not an Irish original, and that's corned beef and cabbage.
Yes, corned beef was not something that Irish ate in Ireland. Beef was a delicacy for the wealthy. The poor could rarely afford meat, and when they did have meat, it was not beef. More likely, it was pork or ham.
Right. Corned beef became a staple for St. Patrick's Day because St. Patrick's Day was a day to splurge. So for the very poor Irish immigrants living in New York, that meant splurging on whatever meat they could afford, and that generally meant getting salted beef. One source for this was ships returning to harbor. So what would happen is the Irish women would hurry down to the dock and meet the sailors coming back on shore, and they'd buy whatever salted beef provisions the sailors still had available. And well, then they'd take them home where they'd boil it 3 times to remove most of the salt, including cabbage in the third boil, and then serving that was a big deal for them.
Yeah, corned beef only recently joined the rest of the traditions repatriated to Ireland's own celebration of St. Patrick's Day.
Oh, I feel sorry for them.
It's delicious.
Well, and this is also surprising. Wearing green isn't as historic as people might think. Ireland is known as the Emerald Isle, and one classic Irish tune touts the 40 shades of green that you'll find all over Ireland. But blue was traditionally the color of St. Patrick.
As you said, historically, St. Patrick was depicted wearing blue, not green, and blue was considered the national color of Ireland, with a blue flag being the typical Irish standard. The change to green once again goes back to actions by King Henry VIII. Up until Henry VIII, the King of England was considered the Lord of Ireland, but not the King of Ireland. In 1541, Henry VIII, because he just couldn't help himself, had himself declared King of Ireland. With this new title, he needed a new kingly coat of arms, of course. He chose to co-opt the harp on the traditional St. Patrick's blue and put his crown on it. So then, over the years, the blue that had traditionally been Ireland's own became more associated with English domination. This led the Irish, particularly the Catholics who suffered under English rule, to adopt green as their new national color. That also, of course, meant reclothing Patrick. So when the Irish came over to America and brought their devotion to St. Patrick and their affinity for Ireland with them, their color was green.
All right. And one more, St. Patrick's Day thing. What about green beer?
Yeah, let's not talk about things unpleasant.
Knew that would get him. So there you have it. St. Patrick's Day is a very American and very Catholic thing in so many ways. We hope and pray that you will have a holy and healthy St. Patrick's Day.
Wait, I have to close with a toast.
Oh, of course. Of course you do.
A toast. Here's to stealing, cheating, fighting, and drinking. If you steal, may you steal a fair maiden's heart. If you cheat, may you cheat death. If you fight, may you fight for a brother. And if you drink, may you share a drink with me.
Perfect.
Yes.
But perhaps we should close with a portion of the breastplate of St. Patrick.
Yes, that's definitely more fitting.
Yes.
Okay. It is a long, long prayer that invokes God's protection against all manner of misfortune and evil. It begins with an invocation of the Trinity and then has a very well-known portion, and I'll just recite those 2 portions. So it starts this way. I arise today through a mighty strength, the invocation of the Trinity, through belief in the threeness, through confession of the oneness, of the Creator of the creation. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit down, Christ when I arise, Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me, Christ in every eye that sees me, Christ in every ear that hears me.
And we'll include a link to the whole prayer in our show notes. So, enjoy St. Patrick's Day with prayer and appreciation for the great missionary saint of Ireland and the men and women who celebrated his legacy, as well as the religious liberty that our nation guarantees. This has been American Catholic History. If you enjoy American Catholic History, please become a supporter. Get information on how to become a supporter at americancatholichistory.org/support.
Also on our website, sign up for our newsletter, learn more about the history of St. Patrick's Day, see about our pilgrimages, and find other great stories from American Catholic history.
We also love the great reviews our listeners leave. Those and the 5-star ratings help others find us. You can email us feedback, questions, tips for episode topics, or other comments at feedback@americancatholichistory.org. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/American Catholic History, on Instagram at ACH_podcast, and follow us on X at ACH1513. I'm Noelle Heaster-Crow.
And I'm Tom Crow.
McEncrow, you mean?
McEncroda.
Thanks for listening to American Catholic History, brought to you by the support of listeners like you.